Never look out the window after midnight. The new apartment was meant to be an upgrade. Bigger, brighter, and most importantly, with a view. My old place had faced a brick wall. This one, on the 7th floor of a converted warehouse, overlooked a sprawling, poorly lit park that stretched to the river. At night, it was a vast expanse of dark trees and deeper shadows, punctuated by the occasional distant street lamp, a lone, glowing eye in the urban wilderness. I imagined peaceful evenings, watching the stars, feeling connected to something larger than myself. I moved in mid-autumn, the air crisp, the leaves turning. The first few weeks were everything I'd hoped for. I'd finish work, make myself tea, and sit by the large living room window, mesmerized by the quiet dance of the city lights reflecting on the distant river. I slept well, undisturbed by the usual city noises, lulled by the sheer distance from the street. The rule about not looking out the window after midnight wasn't one I consciously made, it was one that slowly, insidiously, formed itself around me, like a web spun from 1,000 tiny threads of unease. It started with the streetlight. There was one particularly old, flickering lamp deep in the park, barely visible through the canopy of trees. Sometimes, late at night, after I'd turned off all the lights and was winding down for bed, I'd glance out. The lamp would flicker, then settle. Just a faulty bulb, I told myself. Old wiring. It happened. Then, the flickering became more pronounced. Not just a random stutter, but a series of quick, purposeful blinks, like a coded message. I'd watch, mesmerized, as it would blink twice, pause, then 3 times, then once. Always the same pattern. I'd rationalize it, power surge, wind, whatever. But a cold knot of curiosity, mingled with something less definable, began to form in my stomach. One Tuesday night, I was reading, procrastinating sleep. My clock read 12, 7 a.m. The apartment was silent, save for the hum of my refrigerator. I looked out, almost reflexively. The park was a sea of black, the trees like jagged teeth against the bruised sky. And there, near the flickering streetlight, a shadow. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was too tall, too thin, a wavering column of darker-than-darkness that seemed to defy the ambient gloom. It stood perfectly still, directly under the lamp, absorbing its light rather than reflecting it. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the branches of a tree playing a cruel visual game. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It was still there, motionless, waiting. I pulled the curtain shut with a violent yank, my hands trembling, my heart hammered against my ribs. I spent the rest of the night huddled in bed, the blankets pulled up to my chin, every creak of the building sounding like footsteps, every distant siren a harbinger of doom. I told myself it was exhaustion, my mind playing tricks. It was just a tree. Just a tree. The next night, I avoided the window. I kept the curtains drawn, played music louder than usual, and went to bed early, determined to break the cycle. I woke at 2:40 a.m., drenched in a cold sweat, my mind filled with the lingering echo of a nightmare I couldn't quite remember. The first thing I did was check the clock. Then, against every fiber of my being, against the fear that still clung to me from the dream, I opened a sliver of the curtain and looked out. The park was still dark. The distant streetlight was still flickering its strange pattern, and directly under it, the shadow stood. It hadn't moved. It was still there, waiting. And this time, I felt something new, something that made my blood run cold. The distinct sensation of being watched. Not just by the shadow, but by everything out there. The trees, the darkness, the very air itself seemed to turn its gaze on my window. I snapped the curtain shut again, but it was too late. The seed of dread had been planted, watered, and was now taking root. I was no longer a casual observer. I was being observed. I began to develop a ritual. Before midnight, I'd pull the heavy blackout curtains tight, ensuring not even a sliver of light could escape or enter. I'd turn off all the lights in my living room, plunge the space into absolute darkness before retreating to my bedroom. It was a desperate attempt to sever the connection, to make myself invisible. But it knew. One night, after meticulously securing the curtains, I went to bed. I must have fallen asleep because I woke with a jolt at 1:15 a.m. The room was cold, unnaturally so. And from the living room, from the direction of the large window, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Not from beneath the floor, not from the walls, but from the window itself, like a fingernail tapping against the glass. My heart seized. I lay motionless, paralyzed by terror. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, matching the beat of my own frantic pulse. Tap, tap, tap. It knew I was awake. It knew I was listening. It knew I was hiding. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened to the incessant tapping, the sound echoing in the cavern of my fear, until the first hint of pre-dawn light began to seep under my bedroom door. The tapping ceased abruptly, leaving a void of silence that felt even heavier than the noise. The next morning, I checked the window. Nothing. No marks, no condensation, nothing to indicate anything had touched the glass. The curtains were still perfectly drawn. It was all in my head, I told myself. A symptom of stress, of living alone, of too much imagination. But the terror was too real, the tapping too distinct. I called my sister Clara. "My apartment's doing weird things," I said, trying to sound casual, trying to make it a joke. "I think I'm just overtired. Seeing things." She listened patiently, then suggested I come stay with her for a few days, a change of scenery. I agreed, eagerly. Anything to escape the oppressive silence, the watchful darkness, the relentless tapping. Staying at Clara's was a temporary reprieve. I slept soundly for the first time in weeks, surrounded by the comforting sounds of her bustling household. But even there, at the back of my mind, a tiny tendril of dread remained. I found myself instinctively avoiding windows after dark, pulling blinds just in case. After 3 days, I returned to my apartment, feeling marginally refreshed, armed with a renewed sense of rationality. I told myself I wouldn't give in to fear. I would confront it, whatever it was. That night, I decided to keep the curtains open. I would stare it down. Midnight came. I sat on my couch, a book open in my lap, my eyes fixed on the park outside. The distant streetlight flickered its usual pattern. The trees swayed in the gentle breeze. Nothing. No shadow. No tapping. Just the quiet, empty park. Relief began to wash over me, a warm current of self-vindication. I had imagined it all. 12:15 a.m. Still nothing. I started to relax, my muscles unclenching. Maybe I was finally getting over it. 12:30 a.m. My eyelids grew heavy. The book slipped from my grasp. I fought against the creeping exhaustion, desperate to stay awake, to prove myself wrong, to prove it wrong. 12:45 a.m. My head slumped. I must have dozed off, just for a moment, a fleeting dip into unconsciousness. I woke with a suffocating jolt, my breath caught in my throat. The room was colder than before, and from outside, directly beyond my window, I heard a sound. Not a tap, not a growl. It was a soft, wet slurp. A sickening, deliberate sound like something large and gelatinous moving slowly over a smooth surface. It was so close, I could almost feel the vibration of it against the glass. My eyes snapped open, wide with terror. I scrambled to my feet, my legs wobbly, and stared at the window. The park was still dark. But directly outside my 7th-story window, pressed against the glass, was a faint, glistening smear. It was translucent, slightly amber, and impossibly large, covering almost a third of the pane. It pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, with a slow, organic rhythm. And in the center of that smear, a single, perfectly round, unblinking black eye stared back at me. It was dull, ancient, and utterly without emotion. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore from my throat, shattering the silence of the night. I stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table, sending books and mugs crashing to the floor. My eyes remained fixed on that eye, that impossible, indifferent eye. It blinked slowly, then another wet slurp echoed as the smear seemed to contract slightly, pulling back. I fled the apartment that night. I didn't pack, I didn't lock the door, I just ran. Down the 7 flights of stairs, out into the deserted street, my bare feet slapping against the cold pavement. I didn't stop until I reached Clara's apartment, bursting through her door, incoherent with terror. Now, I live in a different city, in a ground-floor apartment with no windows that face anything but a solid brick wall. I keep the blinds permanently drawn, and I have a pathological fear of glass. I sleep with a dozen lights on, and I never, ever turn them off. The sound of traffic, of sirens, of human voices is a constant, necessary balm. But sometimes, when I'm alone, and the city finally quiets down, and the hands of the clock creep past midnight, I hear it. A faint, distant tap, 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 a soft, wet slurp, and the chilling, undeniable sensation of an ancient, unblinking eye staring at me, through the brick, through the drywall, through my very soul. Never look out the window after midnight, because some things aren't meant to be seen, and some things, once they see you, never forget. He shouldn't have looked under the bed. The apartment was perfect. Or, what passed for perfect in my budget. A third-floor walk-up in an old building, tucked away on a side street where the city's roar softened to a distant hum. High ceilings, hardwood floors that creaked with the weight of decades, and a single large bedroom window that looked out onto a forgotten patch of overgrown communal garden. It was cheap, quiet, and mine. A fresh start after a particularly messy breakup, a place where I could finally just be. Leo, my roommate from college, had helped me move in. As we wrestled my ancient mattress up the narrow stairs, he joked, "Looks like the kind of place where things go bump in the night." I'd laughed it off. I was a rational man, a software engineer. Ghosts, ghouls, things under the bed, they were for bad horror movies and children's nightmares. Not for me. Not anymore. I'd left those kinds of fears behind with my childhood. For the first few weeks, the apartment was indeed a sanctuary. The silence was deep, comforting, a stark contrast to the relentless noise of my previous life. I worked long hours, ordered takeout, devoured entire seasons of shows, and slept like a log. My bed, a simple frame with just enough clearance for a few storage boxes, felt secure, a personal island in the calm ocean of my new life. It was a haven, a place of peace. The first hint of something amiss was so minor, I almost didn't register it. I was lying in bed one Tuesday night, scrolling through my phone, lost in a labyrinth of social media, when I heard a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. It seemed to come from directly beneath my mattress. I pulled out my earbuds, the sudden silence of the room amplifying the faint sound. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was the pipes, the old building settling into its nightly rhythm, or maybe even a loose spring in the bed frame, a minor defect in my well-worn mattress. I shifted, propped myself up, and checked under the bed with my phone's flashlight. Nothing. Just the inevitable dust bunnies I'd yet to conquer, a forgotten socks, and my stack of unopened moving boxes still waiting to be unpacked. I shrugged, a flicker of irritation, put my earbuds back in, and soon drifted off, dismissing the incident entirely. The tapping returned the next night. And the night after that. It was always subtle, never loud enough to truly jolt me awake from a deep sleep, but insistent. A persistent rhythm, like a tiny, unseen hand drumming lightly against the floorboards directly below where my head lay, a silent, relentless metronome. It only happened when I was already in bed, when the lights were out, and when the apartment was otherwise completely silent, the city's hum finally receding. If I so much as moved, or reached for my phone, or even consciously focused on it, it would cease immediately, only to resume once I was perfectly still again, my body relaxed, my mind beginning to wander. It was a game, a cruel, passive-aggressive one, and it was starting to fray my nerves, chipping away at my hard-won tranquility. I started leaving the lights on, a childish attempt to ward off the unseen, but the tapping persisted, a silent defiance of the artificial brightness. It was as if the light merely highlighted the exact spot from which the sound emanated, making it even more pronounced in my mind. I tried to ignore it, to lull myself to sleep through sheer force of will, reciting mental lists, focusing on my breathing, but the sound had become a focal point for my anxiety. My sleep, once so restorative, became fractured, punctuated by moments of intense, unsettling awareness, my mind constantly on edge, waiting for the next tap. My rational explanations began to feel flimsy, transparent, unable to hold against the insidious intrusion. Pipes didn't stop when you moved. Loose springs didn't play a rhythmic beat that paused at your attention. Then the feeling began. A subtle, almost imperceptible pressure on the mattress, just at the very edge, near the foot of the bed. It wasn't the weight of a person. Not exactly. More like a cat jumping onto the bed, a fleeting depression, or a heavy book being placed there, but lighter, softer, more insidious. But there was no cat. No book. It was an indentation in the mattress that I could feel beneath my leg or hip, but never see when I glanced down. I'd lie there, rigid, my breath held, every nerve ending screaming, sensing the faint dip, the subtle shift in the springs, the fabric stretching. And it would always be accompanied by the tapping, now slightly softer, closer, muffled, as if whatever was making the sound had moved from the floor to the underside of the bed frame itself, or even nestled between the springs and the mattress. I considered buying a new bed, a solid platform frame, with no space underneath, thinking to deny it access, to seal off its domain. But a chilling thought stopped me mid-search. If I closed off the space, what if whatever was there suddenly had nowhere to go? What if it was trapped, forced into the room, no longer content with its hidden perch? Or worse, what if it was forced onto the bed, into my immediate space, no longer a hidden presence but an undeniable tactile horror? The idea made my stomach clench, a wave of cold dread washing over me. It was a ridiculous thought, I told myself, a testament to my sleep-deprived imagination and too many late-night documentaries. Yet, I couldn't shake it. The platform bed remained unpurchased. My friends noticed the change. I was constantly tired, my eyes shadowed with dark circles, my skin sallow, a nervous edge to my laugh that hadn't been there before. "You look like you're seeing ghosts, man." Leo joked, completely unaware of the horrifying irony. I just forced a brittle smile and muttered something about long hours, a particularly demanding project at work, the general grind of adulting. How could I explain what was happening? How could I tell them that my bed, the very symbol of comfort and rest, had become a source of creeping dread, a nightly stage for an unseen tormentor? They'd think I was crazy. The tapping grew bolder. It wasn't just a gentle drum anymore. Sometimes it would be a distinct scratch, 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 like elongated fingernails dragging across rough wood, a sound that made my teeth ache. Other times, a soft thump, as if something heavy, but not too heavy, was bumping deliberately against the underside of the mattress directly below my spine, or against the headboard where my skull rested. I started sleeping on my stomach, then on my side, trying to put as much distance between myself and the underside of the bed as possible, a futile exercise, but the sounds seemed to follow, shifting their point of origin to match my position, a malevolent dance. It knew where I was. It always knew. The fear wasn't just about the sounds or the sensations anymore. It was about the intent. It felt like something was deliberately tormenting me, observing my reactions, learning my habits, charting my breaking points. It knew when I was awake, when I was trying to sleep, when I was still, and when I was finally slipping into the vulnerable abyss of unconsciousness. And it seemed to take a perverse pleasure in pushing me to the brink, savoring my growing terror, feeding on my dwindling sanity. One particularly awful night, I had a nightmare. I was falling, endlessly, through absolute darkness, the feeling of crushing pressure on my chest, suffocating me, stealing my air, stealing my will. I woke with a gasp, drenched in cold sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The room was black, the city lights outside drowned by a thick, soupy fog that clung to the window pane, and from directly under my bed, a low, guttural growl reverberated through the mattress, a sound that vibrated through every bone in my body, from my teeth to my toes. It wasn't loud, not a roar, but it was deep, resonant, and unmistakably malevolent, ancient, and filled with an unspeakable hunger. It wasn't pipes, it wasn't settling wood, it was alive. And it was angry. That was the night I lost it. The rational dam I had painstakingly built over weeks, months, years, shattered into a million tiny pieces. I scrambled off the bed, stumbling blindly into the corner of the room, my legs tangled, my hands fumbling frantically for the light switch, When the harsh overhead light finally flooded the room, dispelling the oppressive darkness, I stared at the space under my bed, half expecting to see a monstrous shape, something grotesque and terrifying, a creature from the deepest nightmares made real. But there was nothing. Just the dust, the boxes, the empty space, looking utterly mundane, utterly innocent. The growl had ceased. The silence that followed was mocking, a triumphant, chilling quiet that echoed in the aftermath of my terror. I spent the rest of the night on the living room couch, huddled under a thick blanket, shaking uncontrollably, every nerve-ending frayed. I couldn't go back to that room. The very thought made me sick, nauseous with fear. I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that whatever was under my bed was real, and it was waiting for me to return, to lie down, to be vulnerable. The next morning, driven by a desperate, all-consuming need for answers, for proof that I wasn't just losing my mind, I started pulling things out from under the bed. Boxes, old clothes, a forgotten pair of sneakers from years ago. With each item I removed, the feeling of dread intensified, a heavy, oppressive weight in the air, a cold, unseen presence breathing down my neck. My hands trembled as I cleared the last box. The space beneath the bed, now completely empty, bathed in the pale, unforgiving morning light that seemed to expose nothing. I knelt, flashlight in hand, my heart hammering, and peered into the darkness, my eyes scanning every inch of the floorboards. There was nothing. No hidden panel, no secret crawlspace, no forgotten toy, no sign of forced entry. Just the clean, dusty floorboards, the unmarred underside of the bed frame, and the impenetrable shadows that clung to the farthest reaches. For a moment, a wave of profound, exhausted relief washed over me. It had all been in my head. I was just overtired. But then, as I began to stand up, my gaze lingered on a small section of the floorboard directly beneath where my head usually rested. There, etched into the dark-aged wood, was a single, perfect finger-shaped indent. Not a scratch, not a gouge, but a smooth, shallow depression, as if something had rested its finger there, pressing down with immense, patient force, day after day, night after night. And right next to it, almost invisible against the grain, were 3 faint, parallel lines, too perfectly spaced to be accidental, like the very tip of a fingernail had been dragged across the wood, over and over again in a rhythmic, deliberate pattern. The tapping, the scratching, the physical manifestation of its presence, carved into the very foundation of my sanctuary. My breath hitched, my heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. It wasn't just under the bed, it was part of the bed. Or it was claiming the space, marking its territory, leaving its indelible signature. And then, as I stared at those marks, the faint, musty smell of old earth and damp stone, the same smell I'd felt when the cold breath drifted over my face, filled my nostrils, thick and cloying, a taste of grave dust on my tongue. I don't remember screaming, but a distant, raw, animalistic sound vibrated in my ears, echoing the one I'd heard in the dark. I scrambled away from the bed, from the marks, from the smell, from the terrifying knowledge, hitting my head on the bedside table in my haste, a sharp, meaningless pain. The room spun, my vision blurred, tears of terror and despair blurring the edges of the horrifying truth. I moved out that day. I left everything, the furniture, the boxes, the mattress itself, a sacrifice to the unseen. I didn't care about the deposit, the cost, the hassle of starting over from scratch. I just needed to be out. I walked away from that apartment, from that building, without a single glance back. The image of those marks burned into my mind, a permanent scar on my perception of reality. Now, I live in a new city, hundreds of miles away, in a brightly lit apartment building with no space under the bed, just a solid platform that sits flush with the floor, sealed off from any lurking horror. I sleep with all the lights on, a small nightlight glowing in the corner, and a podcast playing softly through the night, a constant stream of human chatter. The sound of human voices, even artificial ones, is a comfort, a shield against the silence, against the thoughts that still try to creep in. But sometimes, when the podcast runs out, or the nightlight flickers, and the artificial quiet descends, I feel it. The faint, undeniable pressure on my mattress, a fleeting dip that shouldn't be there, the distant, rhythmic tap 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 that vibrates not in the room but in the deepest parts of my mind, and the low, resonant growl that seems to echo not from beneath my bed, but from somewhere deep within my own bones, a part of me now. He shouldn't have looked under the bed, because once you see, once you know, there's no unseeing it. There's no unknowing. And sometimes, the very act of seeking proof is the only invitation it needs to truly enter your world, to leave its mark and never, ever leave. At 3:12 a.m., she saw a face in the window staring back. The apartment on Cedar Street was my sanctuary. A studio, small but cozy, nestled on the third floor of an old brick building. My window, the largest feature of the room, offered an expansive view of the city's heart, a bustling intersection by day, a shimmering network of light after dusk, and beyond that, the distant, inky blackness of the river. I'd moved there for the view, for the feeling of being part of something vast, yet isolated enough to find peace. It was perfect for me, a graphic designer who lived and breathed urban energy, but yearned for quiet when the day was done. For the first few months, the view was a constant source of comfort and inspiration. I'd often find myself staring out, a mug of tea warming my hands, watching the city slowly quiet down. The night was a tapestry of distant headlights, blinking tower lights, and the occasional mournful wail of a distant siren. I usually went to bed by 11, my sleep deep and uninterrupted, a luxury I hadn't truly appreciated until now. The unease began subtly. So subtly I almost convinced myself it was a product of my own tired mind. It started with my reflection. Sometimes, when the room behind me was dark and the city lights painted the glass, I'd see a fleeting distortion in my own image. A shadow within a shadow, a stretch of darkness that didn't quite belong. I'd blink, and it would vanish, leaving only my tired face staring back. Just a trick of the light, I'd tell myself. The glass of these old windows isn't perfectly flat. Then, there was the timing. I'm not usually one to check the clock in the middle of the night, but a persistent feeling, a subtle prickle of my skin, would often wake me. And each time, my eyes would invariably drift to the digital clock on my bedside table, its red numbers glowing like a tiny, watchful eye. It was always, unfailingly, 3:12 a.m. The precision of it was unsettling. It felt like an appointment I didn't know I had. I started to dread that hour. As midnight approached, a knot of anxiety would tighten in my stomach. I'd pull the blinds down, thick blackout blinds that I'd installed myself, hoping to seal off the night to keep the outside out, but the feeling persisted. I'd lie awake, rigid, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant drone of the city, and the frantic thump of my own heart. The very air in the room seemed to thicken, heavy with unspoken anticipation. One particularly cold Tuesday night, exhaustion finally won. I must have dozed off, because I woke with a jolt, a sudden, breathless gasp that tore through the silence. My eyes snapped open, immediately darting to the clock. 3:12 a.m. A shiver ran down my spine, cold and immediate. My gaze, against my will, was drawn to the window. The blackout blinds were still down, seemingly secure, but a tiny sliver of light, almost invisible, leaked from the bottom corner where they didn't quite meet the sill, and in that sliver, a shape. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was a distortion in the darkness, a deeper shade of black that seemed to hover just beyond the glass. It was indistinct, formless, yet I felt its presence with an intensity that stole my breath. It was as if the night itself had condensed into a singular, observant mass, focused entirely on my window, on my apartment, on me. My heart pounded, a frantic drum against my ribs, threatening to burst. I squeezed my eyes shut, a desperate, childish plea for it to vanish, for the world to return to normal. When I opened them again, it was gone. Only the faint, ambient glow of the city filtering through the tiny gap remained, a mocking reminder of what I had seen. I spent the rest of the night huddled in bed, blankets pulled up to my chin, my mind racing, trying to find any rational explanation. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. My overactive imagination, fueled by too much caffeine and not enough sleep, perhaps a touch of lingering stress. But the terror was too real, too visceral, a cold, hard stone in my gut. The incidents escalated. The blinds, no matter how tightly I drew them, no matter how many clips I used, seemed to have a will of their own. I'd wake at 12 a.m. to find them subtly shifted, a new gap appearing, just large enough for a sliver of the outside to creep in. Sometimes it was a tiny crack at the top, like an eyelid opening. Other times, a wider opening near the middle, perfectly framing a section of the dark park below or a distant building. Each time, I'd reseal them with trembling hands, my dread growing exponentially, feeding on my dwindling sense of security. Then came the tapping. Faint at first, a soft, insistent tap, tap, tap against the window pane right at the level of my bed, just beyond the glass. It was rhythmic, almost playful, yet utterly terrifying in its implication. It only occurred after 12 a.m., once I was fully awake and staring at the clock, my heart racing. If I moved, it stopped. If I closed my eyes, I could still feel the subtle vibration of it through the wall, through the very air, a ghostly percussion. It knew, it absolutely knew I was awake, and it reveled in its knowledge. I started leaving the lights on, bright, harsh lights that chased away the shadows, but the tapping persisted, a silent defiance of the artificial glare, a high-pitched sound cutting through the electric hum. I'd try to drown it out with music, loud, pulsating beats, but the sound seemed to cut through everything, a high-frequency intrusion into my sanity, a tiny pinprick through the fabric of my reality. My sleep became almost non-existent. My days were a blur of fatigue and anxiety, punctuated by the growing dread of midnight's approach, a countdown to another terrifying encounter. My work began to suffer. My designs lacked inspiration. My focus was shattered. My friends noticed. "Emily, you look terrible," my best friend Sarah said over coffee, her eyes filled with genuine concern. "What's going on? You're never like this." I mumbled something about a demanding project, about the city noise, about the pressures of a busy life. How could I explain that my window, my beautiful view, had become a portal for something unnameable, something that was systematically stripping me of my peace, my sanity? One particularly humid Wednesday night, I had taken every precaution. The blinds were triple-checked, taped down at the edges for good measure with industrial-strength tape. Every light in the apartment was on, burning brightly, creating a fortress of artificial illumination. I was trying to work, to distract myself, to prove that I was still in control, but my gaze kept straying to the window, to the impenetrable barrier of the blinds, a wall between me and whatever lurked beyond. Midnight passed. 1 a.m. 2 a.m. A fragile hope began to bloom in my chest, a desperate, foolish whisper of optimism. Maybe tonight. Maybe it would finally stop. Maybe it had given up. Then, at precisely 3:00 a.m., the lights flickered. Not just a dimming, but a rapid, almost frantic strobe, plunging the room into momentary darkness, then harsh light, then darkness again, a chaotic, disorienting dance. My breath caught in my throat, a choked gasp. I stared at the main light switch, expecting it to be faulty, but it was solid, unmoving. The flickering intensified, a chaotic dance that made the shadows writhe, grow, and shrink in terrifying rhythm. My eyes, involuntarily, were drawn back to the window, a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. The blackout blinds, despite being taped, despite every precaution, were now open, not shifted, not askew. They were pulled apart, forming a perfect, symmetrical rectangle like a carefully chosen frame, and in that frame, at precisely 3:12 a.m., I saw it. A face. It was pale, almost translucent, luminous against the profound darkness of the park, an impossible beacon of horror. It was elongated, impossibly thin, with hollow, sunken cheeks and a jawline that seemed to stretch unnaturally, dislocated from any human form. The skin was smooth, featureless, like old porcelain, or perhaps the surface of an ancient petrified egg, but for two enormous, perfectly round black eyes that absorbed all light, all hope, all joy. They were unblinking, unfeeling, ancient, an abyss of indifference, and they were fixed directly on me. a gaze that pierced through my very being, stripping me bare. It wasn't outside. Not exactly. It was pressed against the glass, but not on it. It was within the glass, or perhaps the glass itself had become its medium, its terrifying canvas. Its features seemed to ripple and distort with the faint reflections of my brightly lit apartment, the harsh overhead glare illuminating its horrifying stillness, as if it were a part of the window, a terrible, living stain, a malignant growth. And then, as I stared, paralyzed by a terror that stole my very voice, freezing the scream in my throat, its mouth opened. It wasn't a human mouth. It was a perfect, seamless black circle, like a void, a bottomless pit of hunger, and from it, a faint, wet slurp echoed, a sound that seemed to come from inside my own skull, a sound of sickening, insatiable hunger, a sound that promised to consume. I screamed. A raw, guttural sound that tore from my throat, shattering the silence of the night, shattering my own sanity into a million irreparable pieces. I stumbled backward, tripping over my chair, sending it crashing to the floor with a deafening clatter. My eyes remained fixed on that face, that impossible, indifferent face, until my vision blurred with tears of terror, hot and stinging. It blinked slowly, once, its black eye expanding and contracting like a grotesque pupil. Then another wet slurp echoed as the features seemed to melt back into the glass, receding, dissolving, and the perfect rectangle of the blinds slowly, impossibly drawing themselves shut, sealing off the horror, but not the memory. I fled the apartment that night. I didn't pack. I didn't even grab my phone. I just ran. Down the 3 flights of stairs, out into the deserted street, my bare feet slapping against the cold pavement, my lungs burning, screaming for air. I didn't stop until I reached Sarah's apartment, bursting through her door, incoherent with terror, pointing wildly at my own reflection in her hallway mirror, as if the face had followed me there, as if it could emerge from any reflective surface. Now I live in a different city, hundreds of miles away, in a ground-floor apartment with no windows that face anything but a solid brick wall. I keep the blinds permanently drawn, heavy, opaque barriers that provide a semblance of security. And I have a pathological fear of glass, especially old reflective panes, avoiding storefronts, mirrors, anything that might offer a glimpse into the other side. I sleep with a dozen lights on, every single one blazing brightly, and I never ever turn them off, not even for a second. The sound of traffic, of sirens, of human voices, is a constant necessary balm, a cacophony that drowns out the quiet whispers of memory, the echoes of that terrible hour. But sometimes, when I'm alone, and the city finally quiets down to a low, distant drone, and the hands of the clock creep past midnight, I hear it. A faint, distant tap-tap-tap, no longer coming from a window, but seeming to emanate from the very air around me. A soft, wet slurp that makes me gag. And the chilling, undeniable sensation of a pale, unblinking face staring at me, through the brick, through the drywall, through my very soul, waiting for the precise moment of 3:12 a.m. Because some things aren't meant to be seen. And some things, once they see you, never forget, never truly let go. This house knows when you're awake. The house on Blackwood Road was advertised as quaint, historic, and exceptionally private. 3 acres of overgrown land, a small clapboard structure painted a faded robin's egg blue, and a long, winding driveway that ended abruptly at a dense thicket of pines. It was a bargain, almost suspiciously so, but I was tired of city noise, of constant sirens, and the hum of traffic that never truly slept. I craved silence. I craved space. This house, despite the slightly unsettling quiet that seemed to hang around it even on a windy day, felt like salvation. I moved in mid-September, the air crisp and carrying the scent of damp leaves. The interior was simple, stripped of character by previous owners, save for a few stubborn patches of floral wallpaper in the pantry and the deep, rich smell of old wood that permeated every room. My first few nights were blissful. The silence was profound, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of unseen creatures in the woods. I slept soundly, something I hadn't done in years, waking to the gentle light filtering through the ancient oak outside my bedroom window. The unease began subtly, like a hairline crack appearing in plaster. I'd leave a coffee mug on the kitchen counter and later find it inexplicably moved a few inches to the left, as if nudged by an invisible hand. Books I'd placed carefully on the nightstand would be slightly ajar, their spines tilted in a way that suggested they'd been handled. I dismissed it as my own absent-mindedness, the quirks of an old house. Old houses groan, they settle, they play tricks on the mind. That's what I told myself. Then came the sounds. Not the friendly creaks and groans of settling wood, but distinct, intentional noises. A soft, rhythmic tap from the floorboards directly above my head as I watched TV downstairs. A faint, almost musical hum that seemed to emanate from the walls, only to cease the moment I tried to pinpoint its source. The sharp, sudden click of a doorknob turning, followed by absolute silence, making me jump from my seat and scan the empty hallway. My heart rate began its nightly ritual of acceleration. I started to notice a pattern, a chilling correlation. These incidents, the moved objects, the purposeful sounds, never happened when I was actively engaged, making noise or moving about. They happened in the quiet moments, when I sat still, lost in thought, when I paused my music to make a phone call. Most disturbingly, they happened when I was drifting off to sleep. The house, it seemed, was most active when my guard was down, when the veil between consciousness and unconsciousness was thinnest. It was learning my rhythms, my vulnerabilities. My paranoia grew. I found myself obsessively checking door locks, double-tapping light switches to ensure they were truly off or on. The shadows in the corners of rooms seemed deeper, more alive. I started avoiding certain rooms after dusk, like the empty guest bedroom upstairs, which felt impossibly cold even with the heating on full blast. I convinced myself that the house had a consciousness, a malevolent awareness, and it was slowly, deliberately driving me mad. One night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the phantom whispers I thought I heard. My eyes were heavy, my body tired, but my mind raced. The room was dark, save for the sliver of moonlight outlining the window frame. I could feel the pull of sleep, the pleasant drift into unconsciousness. Just as my eyelids began to droop, I heard a soft, almost breathy sigh from directly above me. It wasn't the house. It was too close, too personal. It sounded like someone exhaling inches from my face. My eyes snapped open, and the silence that followed was heavy, expectant. The house knew I was awake. After that, sleep became a battleground. I'd lie rigidly, feigning unconsciousness, trying to trick whatever it was. I'd close my eyes, regulate my breathing, even let my jaw go slack. But the moment my mind truly began to disengage, a new torment would begin. The gentle, insistent tap, tap, tap against the headboard, vibrating through the pillow and into my skull. The distinct sensation of the mattress dipping beside me, as if an invisible weight had settled there, pressing down on the springs. Sometimes, a breath of cold air would drift across my face, carrying a faint, musty scent like old earth and damp stone, making my skin prickle with goosebumps, followed by a fleeting impression of a presence leaning over me just beyond the reach of sight. I tried leaving the lights on, but the house would respond by flickering them, slowly at first, then rapidly, until the bulb would pop and plunge the room into absolute darkness, leaving me in a terrifying void. I'd try to sleep on the couch downstairs, only to hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing directly above me, matching my movements. If I turned over, the pacing would halt for a beat, then resume, a mocking rhythm of my own unrest. It was playing with me, a predator toying with its prey, and I was losing. My exhaustion was a weapon being wielded against me. I confessed to my sister, Sarah. She listened patiently, her brow furrowed, her eyes filled with a concern that was more for my mental state than for any supposed haunting. "It's just the stress of moving, Max," she said gently. "You're overtired. You need a break. A change of scenery." She didn't believe me, of course. How could she? I barely believed myself, yet the terror was visceral, undeniable. But the fear was real. It was a cold knot in my stomach, a constant hum in my ears, a relentless pressure behind my eyes. Desperate, I started fighting back. I installed motion sensor cameras, pointing them at every doorway and the stairs, hoping to catch a glimpse, a flicker of proof. I bought loud wind chimes for the porch, hoping the constant clatter would deter whatever silent presence haunted the house, would create enough ambient noise to mask its subtle aggressions. I even tried burning sage, the pungent smoke curling around the corners of the rooms, making me feel foolish but utterly desperate. The internet, a dangerous wellspring of both knowledge and delusion, suggested salt lines across thresholds, iron bells, and ancient incantations. I tried some, then felt an overwhelming wave of self-pity and embarrassment. The cameras recorded nothing but shadows and dust motes dancing in the infrared light. The wind chimes would fall silent at night, even on the breeziest evenings, only to resume their tinkling in the morning, as if a hand had gently cupped them through the hours of darkness. The sage did nothing but make the house smell like a poorly attended spiritual convention, and the feeling of being watched only intensified, as if my feeble attempts were amusing to it. The house was impervious. It observed. It waited. The psychological toll was immense. I lost weight. My skin was sallow, my eyes constantly bloodshot. Simple tasks became monumental efforts. I'd stare blankly at my laptop, unable to focus, my thoughts consumed by the next impending night. I started leaving the house for long drives, just to feel a sense of escape, even if temporary. I'd park by the ocean, the roar of the waves a balm to my frayed nerves, and watch the sun set, dreading the moment I'd have to return to Blackwood Road. The quiet no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a trap, waiting to snap shut. One terrifying night, I managed to doze off, my exhaustion finally overcoming my fear in a moment of utter vulnerability. I woke with a gasp, not from a sound, but from a vivid, suffocating dream. In the dream, I was trapped within the very walls of the house, surrounded by pulsing darkness, the timber and plaster pressing in on me, unable to move or breathe, a silent scream caught in my throat. As I opened my eyes in the real world, the room was bathed in the harsh red glow of the digital alarm clock. The time was 3:17 a.m. And directly over my bed, hanging from the ceiling like a silent, accusing eye, was one of my own motion sensor cameras. It was off, the small red light extinguished. It had been moved from the hallway downstairs, where I had carefully positioned it just hours before. The lens, I noticed with a sickening jolt, was aimed directly at my face. Panic seized me, a cold, blinding wave. I ripped the camera down, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it. That wasn't just a coincidence. That was a message. It wasn't a passive presence. It was an active, intelligent force. It knew. It knew when I was awake, and it knew when I wasn't. It had moved the camera while I slept, positioning it to watch my most vulnerable moments. It wanted me to know that it was always there, always watching. It wanted me to know that there was no escape within its walls. I left the house that morning. I packed only essentials, throwing them into my car with frantic speed, my mind numb with terror. I didn't dare look back at the windows that felt like eyes, judging my hasty retreat. I didn't sell it. I couldn't. It felt wrong, like passing a curse onto someone else, like an unpardonable betrayal. I left it there, sitting alone on Blackwood Road, the blue paint fading further with each passing season, the dense thicket of pines slowly reclaiming the overgrown driveway. I imagined it still standing there, still waiting, still knowing. Now I live in a studio apartment in a bustling city. The constant hum of traffic, the blare of car horns, the distant sirens, they're no longer irritants. They are a comfort. They are noise. They are proof that I am not alone. That there are other people, other lives, filling the space around me, creating a cacophony that drowns out the quiet whispers of memory. I have found a strange solace in the relentless clamor of urban life. But sometimes, late at night, when the city quiets down to a low drone, and I lie in my bed, perfectly still, I feel it. A subtle shift in the air pressure, a faint breath of cold that has no source. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper that brushes against my ear, just on the edge of hearing, saying nothing intelligible but implying everything. And a chilling, undeniable awareness that wherever I am, whatever I do, the house remembers. It waits. And it always, always knows. The baby monitor picked up a voice that wasn't their child. The house on Willow Creek Lane had been a dream come true for Sarah and Mark. A two-story colonial with a sprawling backyard nestled in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac. It was perfect for their growing family, especially with little Lily, their precious 6-month-old, taking up residence in the nursery upstairs. The move had been hectic, a whirlwind of boxes and baby gear, but the promise of a peaceful life made every effort worth it. Mark, ever the pragmatist, insisted on a top-of-the-line baby monitor. "Peace of mind," he'd said, plugging in the sleek white device. "We'll hear every gurgle, every sigh." Sarah, still a little anxious about leaving Lily in her own room for the first time, agreed. The monitor, with its clear audio and crisp video feed, became their tether to their daughter's slumber. For weeks, it worked flawlessly, a comforting presence on their bedside table, broadcasting the soft, rhythmic sounds of Lily's peaceful sleep. The first incident was so minor, Sarah almost dismissed it. It was late, past midnight, and Lily had been asleep for hours. Mark was snoring softly beside her. Sarah, however, was restless, mind still replaying snippets of her busy day. The monitor on her nightstand glowed faintly, displaying a static image of Lily's crib. Then, a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible click. It wasn't Lily, it sounded like a switch, a small mechanical shift. Sarah frowned, listening harder. Nothing. Just Lily's steady breathing, a tiny, reassuring hiss from the speaker. She decided it was just the monitor adjusting, or perhaps interference from a nearby device. She rolled over, trying to sleep. The clicks became a nightly occurrence, always after midnight, always when the house was utterly silent. Sometimes it was a single click, sometimes a series of rapid, almost impatient ones. Mark, a heavy sleeper, never heard it. Sarah, however, became acutely aware of it. It would rouse her from a light sleep, leaving her disoriented and vaguely uneasy. She'd check the monitor, confirm Lily was sleeping soundly, and eventually drift back off, blaming her own sensitivity. Then, the whispers began. They were so faint at first, Sarah thought she was dreaming. A soft, breathy murmur, like wind through dry leaves, barely audible above Lily's gentle breathing. It wasn't a language she recognized, just a soft, indistinct murmuring that seemed to ebb and flow, always from Lily's room. Her heart would pound, a frantic drum against her ribs. She'd lean closer to the monitor, trying to decipher the sounds, but the moment she focused, they would vanish, replaced by the familiar quiet of a sleeping baby. One Tuesday night, a particularly vivid whisper pierced through the monitor. It wasn't just a murmur this time, it was a distinct, albeit distorted, voice. It was low, raspy, and seemed to stretch out its words, each syllable elongated and strange. Sarah sat bolt upright in bed, her eyes wide with terror. This wasn't Lily, this wasn't Mark. This wasn't any voice she knew. She nudged Mark awake, her hand shaking. "Mark, did you hear that?" Mark groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what, honey?" "Lily's fine." He glanced at the monitor, its screen showing Lily peacefully dreaming. "The voice! On the monitor!" Sarah insisted, her voice a desperate whisper. "It wasn't Lily. It was something else." Mark listened for a moment, then sighed. "Probably just interference, Sarah. You're overtired. You're hearing things." He tried to sound reassuring, but his dismissive tone only amplified her fear. He turned over, already drifting back to sleep. Sarah lay awake, rigid with terror, listening to the static hum of the monitor, waiting for the voice to return. It didn't, not that night. But it did. Every night. The voice became clearer, more defined, though still distorted, as if speaking through water. It was always a low, gravelly whisper, sometimes seeming to sing a lullaby that was profoundly unsettling, sometimes muttering what sounded like a string of nonsensical words. It always happened between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., the hours of deepest night, and it always stopped the moment Sarah moved, or made a sound, or even just focused too intently on the monitor. It was aware of her. It knew she was listening. Sarah started recording the monitor's audio on her phone. She filled entire nights with hours of static, Lily's breathing, and then the undeniable, chilling presence of that voice. She played the recordings for Mark, hoping the undeniable proof would make him believe her. Mark listened, his face paling as the raspy whispers filled their bedroom. "Okay," he said, his voice tight. "Okay, that's not right." He tried to clean the monitor, moved it to a different outlet, even bought a new, more expensive one. Nothing changed. The clicks persisted. The whispers continued. The voice, always the same, always speaking to their sleeping child. They called the baby monitor company. The technician, after listening to their frantic explanation, suggested it was likely a frequency bleed from a nearby device, perhaps a walkie-talkie or an old radio. He offered to send a replacement, but the tone in his voice suggested he'd heard stranger things. The new monitor arrived. It, too, picked up the voice. Sarah started barricading Lily's door at night, pushing a heavy armchair against it. She installed a nightlight in the nursery, chasing away the shadows. She even started sleeping in Lily's room on a small cot, but the whispers would still seep into her dreams, a horrifying lullaby. Mark, though disturbed, clung to rationality. "It's just audio interference, Sarah. We have to be logical." But logic was failing them. The voice grew bolder. One night, as Sarah lay in the cot next to Lily's crib, feigning sleep, she heard it. Not from the monitor, but from the room itself. A soft, wet slurp, followed by a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Her eyes flew open. Lily was sleeping soundly. The nightlight cast a gentle glow over the room. Nothing. Yet, the sound had been undeniable. Mark began to change too. His easygoing nature gave way to a constant, watchful tension. He'd jump at shadows, flinch at unexpected noises. He stopped snoring. Every night they lay awake together, rigid with fear, listening to the monitor, waiting for the clicks, waiting for the whispers, waiting for the voice. One desperate afternoon, Sarah went to the local library, searching for answers. She found old town records, dusty newspaper clippings. The house on Willow Creek Lane had a history. It had once belonged to a woman named Alara Thorne, a reclusive spinster who lived alone with a collection of antique dolls. The articles mentioned her eventual disappearance, deemed a runaway, but the tone of the articles was hushed, speculative. Local folklore whispered of strange noises coming from her house late at night, a woman's voice singing unsettling lullabies to unseen children. Sarah's blood ran cold. She remembered the distorted lullabies from the monitor. She remembered the doll collection. Lily had a few antique dolls in her nursery, gifts from a well-meaning aunt. She rushed home, her heart pounding. She found Mark in Lily's nursery, staring at the monitor with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He held Lily tightly, shielding her. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice trembling. It said her name." Sarah looked at the monitor. The screen showed Lily, still sleeping, but the audio was no longer just whispers. It was a low, raspy voice, drawing out each syllable, clear as day. "Lee, my sweet Lee." The voice was directly addressing their daughter. It was no longer interference. It was a presence, a malevolent, ancient presence that had been waiting, patiently, for a new child to arrive in its house. Mark called a priest. A kind, elderly man named Father Michael came to the house, his face etched with concern as Sarah and Mark, frantic and exhausted, explained everything. He listened to the recordings, his eyes widening. He performed a blessing, sprinkling holy water, reciting prayers. For a night, a blissful night, the monitor was silent. Sarah and Mark slept, truly slept, for the first time in weeks. They dared to hope. Maybe it was gone. Maybe Father Michael had driven it away. But the next night, at precisely 3:12 a.m., the clicks returned, followed by the whispers, followed by the voice. It wasn't angry. It sounded sad. A low, mournful sigh that seemed to resonate with an infinite loneliness. "They don't understand. Lee. They never understand." It wasn't just in the monitor anymore. They heard it from the walls, from the floorboards, from the very air around them. It permeated the house, a constant, chilling presence that clung to every shadow, every quiet corner. It wasn't just the monitor picking it up. It was the house itself. They fled. They packed only what they could, leaving most of their possessions, leaving the antique dolls in the nursery, leaving the house to whatever ancient, lonely spirit haunted its walls. They drove for hours, Lily safe and sound in her car seat, until the city lights were a distant memory and the sun began to rise. Now, they live in a new apartment, a modern, sterile place with no history, no creaking floorboards, no old energy. They sleep with Lily in their room, her crib right next to their bed. They don't use a baby monitor. They can hear every breath she takes, every tiny whimper. But sometimes, when Lily is finally asleep and the apartment is quiet, Sarah will hear a faint, almost imperceptible click. And Mark will sometimes wake, rigid with fear, convinced he heard a low, raspy whisper, a voice singing a mournful lullaby, just beyond the edge of hearing. They know it's still out there, waiting, searching. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is truly silent, they hear a faint, distant voice calling out, forever asking for its sweet Lily.